Okay, shall we make a start? Welcome everybody to the second workshop with these excellent papers that we've all been reading from students and postdocs at the Graduate Institute. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Nicola Miller, and I've been asked to chair this session, which is a great pleasure to do so. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussions in each case. So let's, we have one of the participants, Christopher SZABLA, is joining us online, so you'll see him when it's his turn to speak. And let us start now with Emmanuel, I think. Thank you, his paper on the fascist assimilation policies.
Is this, yeah, it's on. Thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you also, Michael, for the invitation and for organizing the conference. I'll briefly give you some elements of context for this research and then summarize the paper also for people in the public that might not have had a chance to take a look at it. So the paper is part of a broader research project about relations between national majorities and minorities in Western Europe during the interwar years. And the goal of the project is to somehow shift the focus of these, the historiography from Eastern Europe to Western European cases and experiences. And more precisely, we focus on Italy, Belgium, and Spain. And in this paper, which is co-written with Alessandro Ambrosino, who's a PhD student here at the Institute, we have looked at the option agreement. So for those of you who are not familiar, in 1939, the German and the Italian government decided to force the inhabitants of the region of South Tyrol, in which there was a German-speaking, an Italian region with a German-speaking minority, to choose between adopting German nationality and move north of the Italian border, or choose Italian, to keep Italian nationality and stay in Tyrol as good Italians, which basically meant accepting the assimilationist policies of the regime. Now, there are two literatures on this episode. One is mostly a regional history literature that doesn't really try to frame this event in the wider context of population movements and minority questions during the interwar years. And more recently, some authors have tried to actually to put this event in a broader context. However, we think that they've tended to overemphasize the extent to which fascist authorities wanted to expel or to push most of the population of Tyrol to move to Germany. And in the paper, we argue that the policy followed by the regime in the second half of 1939 was much more ambivalent, because at the beginning they let basically Nazi authorities and German speakers who were for relocation to Germany to spread propaganda in favor of voting for Germany. And then all of a sudden in September, October, when they realized that most of the population was going most likely to vote for Germany, they decided to try desperately to keep the population in Tyrol. And we argue that this very ambivalent policy can be understood only if you look at the previous 2 decades of policies towards these minorities, and also including also the other minority that Italy annexed at the end of the Great War, which was in Venezia Giulia. And we basically argue that this ambivalence was very consistent throughout these 2 decades and was mostly characterized by 3 major elements. One, they believed that the minorities would assimilate very easily because the Italian civilization was very powerful and they could just surrender to it the power of Italian culture. And even when they realized it wouldn't be so easy, they still thought it would be inevitable. The second was that there was a discrepancy between the means and the goals. So even when they wanted to scale up somehow, for instance, colonization, bringing Italians from other provinces to the region to try to increase the number of, let's say, pure Italians in the region, they ran into financial problems that basically prevented them from reaching their goals. And finally, although they wanted to assimilate this population, they thought it would be inevitable, they still had deep-seated distrust of the members of the minority. So even those who assimilated and showed to be committed fascists, they were always sidelined somehow from position of powers or positions within the party or in the administration. So that's it. I'm really looking forward to your comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. So who would like to start off the discussion? Okay. Yeah, please, Sandrine.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for this paper. I knew nothing about these things, so I was very happy just to know something new, something that I have no idea. My question is very quick. How would you compare this situation with other situations which are in a certain way comparable to it? I'm thinking, of course, the Alsatian, could also opt for France after the annexation of Alsace by Germany in 1871. Or, in Silesia, what happened also with referendum. What do you think? What is specific? Because, you give us a kind of case study and it's a little bit disconnected. And I know that you worked a lot on minorities and so on. So how would you compare? It's my question.
Okay, thank you, Sandrine. As before, we'll collect up a series of questions and give you a chance to respond, Emmanuel, at the end. So Michael, perhaps next. Oh, no, sorry. No, yeah, let's go around the room. That makes sense. Peter.
Thank you. I found this a really provocative and important paper, and I think I agree with you fully that the scholarship on the option has completely somehow ignored this aspect of the humiliation idea in favor of this normative idea that somehow they really want to get rid of all these German speakers and allogeny. So I was very impressed, and I want to add to Sandrine's comment that some of the strategies and presumptions that you talk about here are also quite evident in the nationalizing policies in other states. And I think actually Romania is a really good point of comparison where there's this idea that the seculars are in fact Romanians who had been Hungarianized and they can easily be changed back. I mean, there's this presumption in all of these nationalizing states that somehow hundreds of thousands of people can simply be switched. So one suggestion I also wanted to make was to think a little bit more about the practices of the Italianization and Germanization, so to speak, organizations from the ground up that tried to also initiate these policies, and even before the First World War, because a lot of the practices that you talk about here are actually initiated really in the 1880s and 1890s in associations that are built up to try to win back or change the nationality of various peoples in these linguistic borderlands. And then the other point, two other points. One, I agree with you fully about the financial incapacity of the Italian state here, and I think that's really important, because I would like to know, I mean, the industrialization of Boz and Bolzano is, in fact, in some ways, a bit successful. So why is it a failure? I think it would be helpful if you said a little bit more about that. I also think the problem of bringing in Italian settlers from other parts of Italy raises a different question that you didn't address, but Roberta Perger once gave a paper in which she talked about it, but she never published it, and that was the fear of the Italian government that the Italians being brought in would not perform their Italianness in an adequate way because they tended to be from poorer backgrounds, and they didn't maintain a kind of middle-class respectability, and also they fell into debt. And then turned to the Italian government saying, look, we're the local Italians, you've got to support us. And the government didn't want to do that. So sorry to go on about this, but I think that element also is important. And then I'll send you some specific comments, but I think there's some places where you could actually quote more to sort of illustrate even more some of the contradictions within the Italian nationalist position. But overall, I just want to compliment you on this paper. I think it's really important, and I think it will be received with great interest.
Thank you, Peter. Is there anybody else over that side of the room who would like to lend a...
I was just wondering whether, I think again too, because there were all sorts of things I didn't know about that I learnt from this paper, particularly about the land settlement. But I'm just wondering, because you do use the Trieste comparison quite a bit in the Slovenes, but whether or not, you could use it more to actually highlight the difference in the kind of the idea of the problem of the Germans, because of, it was from my long-term memory, it's fairly clear to me that, they sat somewhere else in the hierarchy and they're much more problematic because you know, Italians as good as Germans or not actually, you know, and can you actually turn them? Whereas Slovenes are different, like much, and because of the policies earlier on in the 20s and afterwards. So yeah, just use it to your advantage.
Okay, let's come to Michael now, please.
Thanks. Yeah, very interesting paper. One comment on the co-authorship. I don't know if it's the case, but it feels like two papers. So halfway in the middle, the style changes completely, and it feels like a different paper. But it's also in terms of the architecture that I wasn't sure about the rationale of having the second part second instead of first. It felt to me like one could just as well switch it without any change, essentially, to the logic of the architecture. And then two comments, one following on from Glenda's. So this is at the moment very implicit in the paper, but like Glenda, I had the feeling that this is not just a problem of a minority, which actually is a majority in the area, but it's a problem of a German minority, right? So in contrast to Slovenes, in Gorizia in particular, I had the sense that the Italians feel that there's this racist hierarchy, right? You can do this or that to Slovenes, but not to Germans, right? Because, in part, because they have a much more powerful state behind them, but probably also because of some imaginary, racist hierarchies and things like that. So that I think could be brought out more clearly. Like Glenda said, and this connects to a second issue, which is the economy. At the moment, there's these several moments where you speak about the economy, and the economy comes in when it is a question of whether the Italian state is actually financially capable of relocating the people. But there's a much larger societal issue to the economy, right? Which is that what happens to the local economy if all the people are gone? It seems to me that this is this is a much more serious problem, right? Who will be your bakers and your and your people on the assembly line if you simply remove them all? So I felt this was something interesting that could perhaps play a slightly larger role still.
Thanks. If we could come around here to Richard Drayton, please.
Thank you for this very interesting paper, Emmanuel. I want to press you on the question of race, because I wondered to what extent one might not bring into one's discussion of this problem the tensions between Nordicism and Mediterranismo in terms of the race theory of Italian fascism. And indeed, to contextualize this also in terms of the much longer run problem of race within the Italian national polity. There's a very interesting article from 2020 on race and Risorgimento, which addresses the way in which this question of the tensions between Northern Italy and Southern Italy was a central problem in that kind of key period, foundational period for the Italian state. And that the question of what to do with the Nordic dimension, how to kind of translate the significance of the Nordic dimension of Italian politics in terms of the identity of Italian fascism is a really important problem. So it seems to me that the whole domestic problem of race is not really addressed in this article at the moment.
Alex? Yep. Then Sebastian.
So this is a follow-up to what I think is Michael's very important question. So just to take a step back, right? I mean, this is a period with lots of population movements, forced population movements, relocations, absorptions, all that. So one of the big questions, really, I think Michael's gesturing in this direction is, when is a population, a particular population defined by religion, language, culture, whatever, a threat, and when is it an asset? Right? So as Michael's suggesting, well, you may have certain reasons that you want to expel or relocate a population, but who's going to bake the bread is a central question. So when is a population a threat? When is it as an asset? That seems to me a huge question of the interwar period that perhaps deserves some theoretical attention here.
And Sebastian, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I also first want to chime in terms of praise for the article. There was so much interesting stuff, so that's great. Lots to build on. Maybe what I'll say doesn't go in the direction that you'll actually want to go, so then you feel free to completely ignore it. But I felt that you were saying, all right, there is this problem, and then there was an Italian policy, and it was flawed in 3 ways. But it didn't become clear to me whether, if it hadn't been flawed, for example, if there had been much more money, would that have changed things at all? I mean, how would we know in the first place, I suppose, would be one question. So my sense is that, whether flawed or not, it's difficult to say to what extent Italian policy was responsible for the outcome. In particular, because the German propaganda side isn't addressed, right? I mean, one would assume that there is some relationality going on anyways. But I don't know, so my reading is from Italian policy, we cannot deduce the outcome. So therefore, I guess I would probably move in a different direction. I would ask, what does this policy tell us about, what does the regime think, who is a fascist, who is an Italian, and so forth, rather than was it effective or not. At least that was my sense. But whatever direction you ultimately take, it seems to me important that at the beginning, or it would be helpful for me anyway, if the larger stakes of the piece could be stated more clearly. So, what do we learn when we understand better the motivations, the calculations, and also miscalculations of the Italian authorities? What does it help us understand better? I think if you can add a little more to that, then the whole piece will just have more punch. But yeah, great piece of work, thanks.
Thanks. I just want to say to people joining us online that you are welcome to put your questions in the chat, and I have got my eye on the chat, so I will hopefully spot if anything comes up. But is there anybody else here who would like to contribute? Okay, I don't see anything coming online either. I suppose just one thing I'd like to throw in, which is just about when Michael referred to it, but the co-writing process is quite an interesting thing in itself, I think. So if you get time, when you've been through all the sort of questions of substance, it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how you set about it and how you think you might respond to Michael's prompt to think a little bit more about how to weld it together. Because we all find it really rewarding, I think, to write with somebody else, but it's also difficult. It's really hard to do well. So it's interesting to reflect on that a little bit, perhaps. Anybody else? Michael, yeah.
I had one small thing. The word assimilation and assimilated comes up a lot, as if we all knew what exactly it is. So I think it could be unpacked into smaller units. Right. Yeah, the term assimilation could be fragmented into smaller, more tangible units, I thought.
Great. Okay, Emmanuel, you have sort of 7 or 8 minutes to fly through all those questions and respond to what you choose to respond to.
Well, first, thank you very much. It's a lot, it's rich, it's to the point. There are some comments to which I don't even think I can answer. I'll just thank you and try to implement them or give more thought to them. So I'll try to go through them quickly. Professor Scott, thanks a lot. I think, I'm not sure I can compare to Alsace before the Great War, like you were referring to 1871. I think I can to Silesia and other plebiscites that were organized, because this was not really a plebiscite, although it was turned into a plebiscite by the German authorities. So actually people weren't asked to vote like they didn't have to vote on a specific day, or they could even not go and decide not to actually opt, although if they did that, it was assumed that they would remain in Italy. And it was also a strange, so many compare this to population transfers, although there was an element of choice that there wasn't in many other population transfers that occurred at about the same time or slightly later. So in many ways, I think I followed a little bit at the beginning of the paper this literature that somehow put it in the context of population transfers, but I think you are right in suggesting that maybe the comparison should be broader, and also, for instance, with the kind of the plebiscite, or rather the popular consultation in Open Malmedy, for instance, at the end of the war. So I think in that respect, in the introduction probably, or in the first section when I frame the paper, I can refer to wider experiences, and precisely because it's an experience that is a little bit in between these different practices that were at the time. To go on to Peter's comments, thanks a lot again. Yes, the nationalizing policies are very common, and especially the assumptions, as you say. And there I actually have in mind something I have still to start working on, but I would like to write a comparative piece about how precisely state authorities, officials on the ground, but even party members within the fascist party, but also in other cases, precisely pointed out this idea of national indifference, and the idea that if you get rid of the agitators, you would easily assimilate all the masses. So in a way, national indifference is a framework that is deployed to legitimize some policies at the time, or even slightly before, or slightly later, as you argue. So I totally agree with you on that, and it's something I would like to work on in a more comparative fashion later. Concerning the financial incapacity of the Italian state, it is true that the industrial area in Bolzano worked, but it is also true that Asperger has shown she talks about what you mentioned in the last book, Mussolini's Nation Emperor. And I also saw some of the files that she saw, and I collected some more material about that. So basically, there were two main problems with the land acquisition programs in South Tyrol. They couldn't rival often German capitalists that were behind the farms that they wanted to buy. And also, when they bought, they managed to buy the farms and to settle Italians from other regions, often because these, and this relates also to what, not you, Michael, I think, to Professor Dreyer's comment, what basically they didn't have workforce coming from other regions that had the expertise to run these farms. So the farms were not profitable, so they had to be run on a debt, and the state at some point was basically, the state treasury was refusing to pay. And so at some point there are also interesting exchanges between the authorities in South Tyrol and Rome, in which the authorities in South Tyrol ask whether they can settle German farmers, because they can't find anybody who's able to run the farms without incurring into that. So in that respect, this is one instance in which you clearly see these limits, which you don't see in Bolzano for other reasons, but you see more broadly. And Bolzano is it's an important experience, but it's also very territorially very concentrated. So it doesn't serve the purpose of settling people all around South Tyrol in order to somehow change the demographic balance of the region. Professor Sluga, I totally agree with you. In this paper, I wanted to emphasize the commonalities, because I think the differences don't undermine the argument. So, but you are right that maybe if I emphasize the differences and I claim that they don't undermine the argument is even stronger. But what I'm saying is just that even if, of course, there was a civilizational stereotype whereby the Slavs were considered inferior, as compared to the Italians, but especially also as compared to the German speakers of South Tyrol, still there was this assumption that German speakers would eventually assimilate if you get rid of the agitators that somehow foment the masses against the regime. So in that respect, I think is something that probably I have to bring up more clearly, but it doesn't necessarily undermine the argument. Michael, structure and architecture, yes. I guess we wanted to start from the options because from the option agreement because it's somehow the prompt, and it's also what this dissatisfaction with the literature is what somehow moved us to engage with the topic and then go backwards somehow. But it is true that maybe it's a more linear story if we mention the option in the introduction, but then we tell a more chronological somehow story that then somehow climax with the details of the option agreement. I think it's also a matter of trying to move around the section and see how it works, but it's definitely a relevant point. And yes, concerning the economy, many authors mentioned the fact that the Italians didn't have the money to pay for 200,000 people to relocate because the Italians had to compensate people who had property. But then later they realized that this other argument come up, and it's quite surprising that it doesn't come up before. So it is as if they didn't really think about this. And to me, this is a confirmation that they weren't aiming at this massive. They didn't think that so many people would vote for Germany. And they realized it in October and October 39, and then the priority was try to convince everybody not to go. And then later they realized, okay, and if now everybody moves quickly, we have a problem. But it doesn't come up in the preparation or in the period during which people were supposed to opt or not. And then in the end, only 70,000 people moved, mostly without property. So it had a lower impact than expected. And assimilation, yes, I mean, the definition that I would propose that I would add to the paper is simply Rogers Brubaker, a policy of making similar, but of course you can unpack it. And I think it would be useful, especially concerning, with regard to the argument that this relationship between inclusion and distrust, it would be useful probably to unpack it, as you say, because it can be inclusive, but at the same time entail this contradiction. And also it can be inclusive, but at the same time very violent and coercive in terms of forcing the population to abandon its language and culture. And then very quickly, because I think we are running out of time maybe. Yeah, so just to reply to the last three comments. Race, yes, it is a topic that has already been dealt by some authors, so that's also why I don't really focus on it, but it was a problem, and then maybe I can go into the details later if you want, maybe in a coffee break or in one of the, or later on today. Population is an asset or a threat is a long story, and maybe I also won't address that now. And I just wanted to come back on the comment about why the fact that what's the counterfactual if they hadn't followed those flawed policies, whether this would have been different. Of course, we cannot say that for sure, but I think that these flaws that are flaws, if you take the fascist perspective to some extent, are very helpful to explain the ambivalence during the option, at the time of the option, so the second half of 1939. So in that respect, there is a link. What we were trying to point to was the continuity somehow between the ambivalence during the option and during the previous 2 decades. But it is true that thinking beyond this idea of flaws could help frame the paper in a broader framework somehow, in order to, as you also mentioned, understand what it tells us about something beyond the specific case. And I think the last argument that I was making about precisely this segregationist homogenization, I think that would be probably something I would try to build upon more in order to make a broader argument. So that's my work.
It would also be interesting, I mean, in the German case, it would be impossible to say, look, this is the Nazi policy, didn't work because it was flawed. And these are the reasons why it was flawed. It would politically be impossible. I don't know, maybe the Italian situation is different, but to look at a fascist policy and say, look, they were flawed, but they could have done much better.
Yep.
I don't know, apologies, but in Germany, definitely, this wouldn't fly. So I don't know if that's an issue for you.
I don't know. I have to think about it. I think it would. I think in Italy it wouldn't be so shocking, but maybe you're right. In any case, thank you very much.
Well, thanks to you, Emmanuel. That was a really thoughtful paper and discussion.
Sorry, I didn't address co-writing, but.
Don't worry, I think we are out of time. It's something to think about and talk about at some point anyway. Thank you so much, and all the best with the developing your work. Okay, so now we move to Chris. Chris, do you hear us?
I hear you. Do you hear me?
Very faintly. I think we need to get the volume up if we can, please. Try again.
Better now?
A little bit, but we still really need you louder. Can the tech help, please?
Is that working?
I think maybe you need to go a bit closer to the...
How is this?
That's better. That's better. It's not going to be
Okay.
very comfortable, but I think you're going to have to do that, I'm afraid.
I'll speak as close to the microphone as possible.
Okay, you're fine now. So yeah, so if you'd like to give us a few opening remarks about your paper.
Sure, absolutely. First, thank you for inviting me, Michael, and everyone else involved in the conference. Sad I can't be there in Geneva with all of you. I guess we could conceive of it as a product of the methodological nationalism with which the world has sort of handled COVID. This sort of vaguely titled paper actually concerns primarily an episode which is a little bit more specific, which is the Italian attempt to create an alternative internationalism concerning migration in the interwar period. So creation of this alternative internationalism by fascist Italy. But it's a vaguely titled paper in some respects because it's looking at different dimensions in which fascist nationalism moves beyond the borders of the national state. And specifically, I look at empire, at migration, and of course, at internationalism as these different concepts. As an aside, I found the panels yesterday extremely illuminating and helpful in thinking about a lot of these concepts, in wrestling with many of the same questions that I did when I was drafting this paper. Nonetheless, I think it's really interesting how all of these concepts are sort of tied together in this Italian attempt to frame this alternative migration internationalism. It was an attempt to draw together the diasporic Italian community that had migrated abroad, that was sort of informed by imperial ways of thinking about that diaspora, and that was attempted to be achieved on the international stage. And of course, in both the potential of fascist internationalisms discussed in the paper, race plays a role, and that's something that I also wrestled with, and I'm happy to talk about a little bit more should there be questions, and I'm even more happy to hear suggestions about how to handle it. Nonetheless, tension between the desire to make this alternative fascist internationalism a kind of extension of Italian nationalism in an imperial way beyond the borders of Italy, and tension between Italy and other states that had their own priorities in assimilating migrant populations, inevitably sort of made this alternative internationalism not work out. That is not to say that there were not other forms of fascist internationalism concerned with migration that may have worked out, and I discussed very briefly the potential for a corporatist internationalism concerned with migration as well. But that did not interface well with some of the nationalist priorities then of different fascisms. And so I suggest very briefly, and I don't mean for this to be seen as a primary causal mechanism in any way, but that the absence of the availability of any of these internationalist alternatives to immigration and settlement of populations abroad potentially in some way helped contribute to the movement toward territorial aggression that we see toward the 1930s. But again, it's very much a suggestion rather than an attempt at a causal argument, and the main purpose of the paper is to sort of illuminate the existence of these internationalist potentialities that were embraced by fascism, in particular by Italian fascism. So really look forward to your comments and criticisms, particularly because, as I note, this is really more of a thought experiment than at the moment a potentially publishable paper. I think I really wanted to extract this sort of moment from my broader research on migration internationalism and think about the different ways in which it could be explored historiographically and theoretically. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Questions and comments? Peter.
Thanks. Chris, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for this paper. I really enjoyed it. I like the arguments that you made, especially the way you tried to connect migration and nationalism and internationalism in the context of fascism. I think you yourself are aware that you are juggling a lot. So a piece of advice that's cheap is try to keep the piece focused on the points where these issues really do come together. You don't need to define fascism, for example. You may feel a bit uncomfortable because you say you don't have much experience in the study of fascism, and that's probably an advantage, actually, because there are places in this piece where you, I think, take fascist claims, ideological claims, philosophical claims a bit too seriously, at the expense of actual fascist practice, which I think is much more important. I do have two comments. One is that you use the term corporatism, and the reader is going to need more of an elaboration of what corporatism is supposed to mean in the context of debates about migration. You make a lot of statements and you have a lot of presumptions about corporatism, but you never explain what you mean by corporatism. Okay, no one wants to have to define corporatism. That's sort of a given in this field, but everybody wants to use the word. The Italian state obviously does set up corporations and I think has a pretense to a corporatist system, but in your, I wouldn't take it that seriously either. I wouldn't say fascists are corporatists in practice necessarily. There's a lot of ideology about corporatism and about the relationship between workers and management and owners and the state, but it doesn't actually get it doesn't actually get put into practice the way some of the ideology says. So please define it a little bit more clearly for us when it comes to migration. The second point is, you start out sort of with Germany and Italy as the two examples you want to use, but as you just said, this is clearly a paper about Italy, and I think that's what it should be. I think Germany is helpful as a reference point for comparison for different approaches, but this is clearly a paper about Italy, and so I would frame it as such. I think that the development that you suggest at the end, showing why empire, territorial empire, has to be the outcome of these international efforts to control migration, is a really interesting conclusion. I like it a lot. And just to conclude, I've written a lot of comments on, specific comments in the paper, and I will send them to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other contributions, particularly from that side of the room, first of all. Sandrine, thank you.
I will be very quick. I mean, at the beginning of your paper, you mentioned that there is not so much literature on fascist internationalism, and I have to contradict you. There is a growing body of literature on fascist internationalism. I don't want to tell, I mean, right now to give all the names, so I will write you an email with references. Okay, so that you can really, and in particular, if you want to compare fascist Italy or to see the entanglements between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, there is now a large body of literature on that. So I will send you the reference.
Thank you. Richard.
Hello. You write on page 2, yet how to reconcile German demands, often of the international system, for the restitution of distant colonies, largely populated by non-Germans, or the subject peoples of fascist Italy's expanding colonial empire with fascism's ethno-nationalistic focus. I'm not sure why, I don't see this as at all surprising. It has to do essentially with racial ideas of political personality. The non-Germans and non-Italians in these colonial spaces are not political persons. They are socially dead, in Orlando Patterson's terms. They're therefore they're not a problem, they're not a threat to the ethno-nation, which exists in a separate compartment. The problem really is what happens in the Heimat, what happens in the kind of home territories, and the risks there of forms of ethno-national compromise or dilution.
Thank you. Yes, Emmanuel, of course.
Thank you, Christopher, for this very interesting paper. I just have a quick comment, but you already addressed part of it. So I had the impression that you were making that causal link in the paper, but it's good that you mentioned that that you're not necessarily suggesting that there is, but maybe then, I don't know, maybe it was just a personal impression, but I have the impression that in the paper it looks like you're making that connection. But then still there is quite a straight line between, you know, attempts to protect minorities in other countries, then the attempt at the ILO, and then, or to build an alternative internationally to the ILO, and then the invasion of Abyssinia and the creation of, you know, a different internationalism in that respect. And I think if you want to draw that line, consulting Italian archives will be key, because right now you are a little bit you know, deducing it from sources that, of course, also involve Italian actors, but they're not necessarily primarily created by them. So I think it would be just, if you want to draw that line, you would need to avoid criticism to take a look at Italian archives at some point. It's just, I thought. Thanks.
Would anybody else like to contribute? And I guess one thing I was thinking about, Chris, is, I mean, I love the idea of a thought experiment, and I think it's great that you're doing that. But even when you're doing a thought experiment, I think it can be helpful just to think, at least sort of set up in your mind a range of possibilities of different audiences and different historiographical traditions that you're thinking about, because you don't have to tie yourself down at this stage. You can still kind of play around intellectually in the way that you want to do, but it does at least, I think, help you to kind of frame your thinking. And I think it strengthens actually the process of doing an experiment. You kind of think more precisely, well, I could think about it like that if I'm thinking about it in relation to that audience, etc., etc. So that may be something that's helpful to do, to kind of take some of the responses that people have offered and think about, as you're playing around with these ideas of potential internationalisms, then think about the different audiences, the different ideas that you're trying to respond to. Would anybody else like to make, yes, please, Lydia.
Thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed reading this. I wanted to second the point about really defining corporatism and sort of how the sort of corporatist imperial state is like a specific sort of type model, what you want to call it, and how it deals with refugees. And just an out of left field recommendation that probably isn't terribly relevant. I'm thinking of Melissa Teixeira's work on sort of corporatist exchanges between Portugal and Brazil across, I mean, not necessarily in the interwar period. She goes past the Second World War, but and this is much more about goods and commerce rather than people, but it is about movement. And sort of how these sort of strong centralized states handle the flow of goods and people, and whether that is specific to them or not. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other hands? Okay. Oh, Michael? Yeah.
So, hi, Chris. Nice to meet you finally, or at least see you on the screen. And thanks for joining us. So I also enjoyed this paper. I think it has a lot of different possible avenues to explore. Like Peter said, I think it's a case of probably pulling them together into one direction, so that as a reader you don't get the feeling that come page 15 you pile on corporatism, and then after corporatism that, you know, but to have it all there from the beginning and make clear where you see the main contribution. From what you now said, it sounded as if you felt that the main contribution was in illuminating how usually discrete discussions, namely about migration, about nationalism, about empire, and about internationalism, are sort of folded together in this topic, which I think if that's where you see it, there could be case for announcing this more clearly from the beginning, so everybody knows what to expect. I mean, at the moment, what you say in the beginning is, at least that's how I read it, is that you formulate it as a surprise that there's this expansionist imperialism coexisting with a form of ethnic nationalism that, of course, you know, doesn't recommend the conquest of territories inhabited by people who don't belong to the ethnic nation. And a little bit like Richard Drayton, I mean, I was thinking, should we find this surprising? It happens all the time on a certain level, right? Which may be not a good reason not to find it surprising, but it's also you abandon it thereafter as a theme, right? I thought, you know, do you see this as a constant tension? Is this a real problem for them? It seemed like you frame it as a problem, as a surprise, but then none of your actors actually thinks much about this in terms of a problem, because they don't find these two sides irreconcilable or anything of the kind. So you abandon it then as you go along. Right.
All right, Chris. So 7 or 8 minutes to respond, please.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for your really useful comments. Let me start, I guess, with Peter, and I think it goes without saying that the majority of the comments, especially from Peter, I think I'm going to just take them on board to help improve my thinking about this subject, rather than to kind of push back in any way. I guess one thing I would say about your comments, Peter, is, you say, maybe I take fascist claims a little bit too seriously at the expense of practice. I do wonder if there's a way in which one should return sometimes to those claims rather than solely looking at practice, particularly when we're thinking of potential ways of thinking. Maybe considering not so much the intellectual history of fascism, I want to say, but the kind of ideational history in which, bringing up these forms of conceptualizing fascism in an internationalist way are potentially important for understanding ways in which fascist states did act in different ways. So I wonder if claims have a role to play, maybe a little bit more than your comments seem to imply. Then on the question of the comparison between Germany and Italy, yeah, I completely agree. And this is going to be a really difficult comparison. I think anytime anyone is doing a history of the interwar period and involving both of these sort of classically fascist states, because the temporality just doesn't necessarily work out to look at what a fascist Germany would have done in the 1920s, for example. So I think it is somewhat difficult to go into that. And I think another way that I could potentially resolve it is to look a little bit more at German fascist parties and their ideology with regard to internationalism during this period. But I do take on board and agree with your suggestion that another way that would work very well is to look at Italy more specifically and alone. On Sandrina's point with regard to the literature on fascist internationalism, so I mean, if you a little further into the paper, I do kind of summarize some of this literature, and maybe I've missed some, and I really welcome your email and your comments further about this. And I agree that there's a really growing literature. I think I use that terminology even specifically. What I find is that a lot of the literature on fascist internationalism is not the kind of internationalism that I'm approaching here. A lot of it has to do with interlinks between fascist movements globally, maybe sort of a global history of fascist movements and their connections. On the one hand, interlinks between different fascist states that are cooperating. But what I'm looking at here is fascist states, and particularly fascist Italy, in the fora of Geneva and creating universalist internationalist fora of their own. So it struck me that there's and I could be completely wrong about this, and again, I welcome your suggestions, but it struck me that there was a little bit more of a lacuna on those forms of internationalism specifically. On Richard's point about the management, I guess I could call it, this is how I conceptualized it, the management of diversity within a fascist empire. I don't know that I would necessarily say that all the literature that I'm aware of uses this conception of how minorities work within fascist empires, that they're entirely sort of dead and gone. There does seem to be a little bit more disagreement about that, and a little bit more movement in the growing literature on fascist imperialism in terms of thinking about how minorities work within fascist empires in ways that are similar to ways that they work within other forms of empire as well. That seems to be where the historiography of fascist empire is heading, and correct me if I'm wrong about that. But this is sort of a minor point that I do make in passing in the paper, so I don't mind abandoning it in the face of criticisms. I completely agree that consulting Italian archives would enrich this work considerably. I would love to be able to do so, maybe someday in the future when borders are open. So thank you for that comment, Emmanuel. And I'm very grateful to have you on this panel and being able to comment on this, given your own paper and its look at minorities under Italian fascism. Nicola, I completely agree that audience is an important question, and that I think is an important component of how the paper is focused. The question of defining corporatism that came up in Peter's comments and in Lydia's comments, I completely agree with this as well. Actually, I think I avoided going into too much detail on the question, particularly because I knew we were going to be considering nationalism more specifically in this conference, and I wanted to, in the interest of compacting this paper a little bit, sort of avoid thinking too much about too many other subjects. As some of the criticisms have enunciated, there's a lot going on in the paper already, so I didn't want to drag it too far into the realm of corporatism. I thought, I'll just leave this as a point of potential comparison. But I completely agree that a more systematic definition in a standalone work that isn't concerned necessarily with examining solely the nationalistic aspects of this question would be really important. Michael, your organizational comments about introducing the paper with this tie-up between these subjects a little bit better is really valuable. The point about it not being a surprise that there is this nationalism that sort of not only transcends borders but continents is, I think, really important, and maybe something that I don't know if you agree with this, but maybe should also be emphasized, particularly if it comes as a surprise to the reader. If the actors don't find it a surprise, then that's potentially an interesting point of divergence. But I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Right, many thanks, Chris. Great. Thank you very much for the paper and the discussion, which is really fascinating. Okay, let's move on now to Joel's paper.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Professor Goebel, for this invitation, and thank you to all of you for being here, for having read our papers. It's really exciting and encouraging to have this kind of feedback from such great scholars. My paper is entitled Clashing Kingdoms, Refugee Movements, Nationalism, and the February 1919 Massacre of Armenians in Aleppo. And it centers around a grim and largely forgotten incident in Aleppo immediately after the end of Ottoman rule in the city, when about 50 Armenian refugees, genocide survivors, were killed in a mob attack in the city. And just to contextualize this time period a bit, for those who aren't intimately familiar with it, during World War I, as was discussed yesterday, the Ottoman state decided to liquidate the Armenian population of Anatolia through a combination of massacres and deportations. And about 40,000 Armenians who had been deported survived by hiding in Aleppo, which was the largest city along the deportation route towards the killing fields in the Syrian deserts. In late 1918, Ottoman forces retreated from Aleppo, and 2 years later, France would conquer Aleppo and the rest of Lebanon and Syria and ruled them for 26 years. But in between the Ottomans and the French, there was a short-lived Arab government supported by the British that tried to make a Syrian Arab nation-state a reality. And it was during this period of the Arab government that the massacre of Armenian refugees in Aleppo happened. And one might ask, do we need a special explanation for mob violence against refugees? If you move 40,000 destitute people into a war-fatigued city with a population of less than 200,000, there are bound to be tensions, and tensions can lead to violence. We saw this very sadly a week and a half ago in Ankara, when a mob of local Turkish people attacked some Syrian refugees after a dispute between some youths. Nevertheless, I argue that the political and ideological climate of Aleppo in 1919 drove this violence, in effect, and shaped the way in which it occurred, perhaps more importantly. Specifically, I tried to situate the violence within two different ideological conflicts. The first is the clash between two different nationalist movements in Aleppo, the Arab and the Armenian. And the second is the clash between nationalism itself and the older Ottoman model of managing difference, what I call the Ottoman religious hierarchy. From the perspective of Muslims in Aleppo, who had been socialized in that hierarchy, the actions of Armenian nationalists and community leaders constituted a provocation. They saw it as previously subservient Christians moving out of their place. On the other hand, in the novel vision of political belonging brought by the Arab nationalists, Armenians were again excluded, not because of their religion, but because of their ethnicity. They were not Arabs, and as such, they were at best guests in the new polity that the Arab nationalists were trying to create. So these overlapping conflicts and this double exclusion of Armenians made it extremely difficult for the local authorities to resolve problems between the city's communities, and equally difficult to reconcile the two sides after the massacre had taken place. So the ideological currents flowing in Aleppo in 1919 transformed the meaning carried by the Armenians' double status as minorities and migrants, with deadly effect. So I look very much forward to your feedback.
Great. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Who would like to start? Michael.
So yeah, thanks first of all, Joel, for a great paper, which I enjoyed a lot. It's very well written. It's compelling, almost riveting, and it has a very clear argument, which I found entirely compelling, which is this argument, as I understood it, that the massacre is explained by these two overlaying frameworks, right? So you have the rise of nationalism on the one hand and these competing nationalisms. However, they don't in themselves suffice. It needs the, I don't know if you say overlaying or how you call it, with this older imperial framework of religious hierarchies. And I found this very convincing, especially as you come back to it again on various occasions throughout the paper, when you actually explain the sources that you bring to the table, which in themselves, again, are great. So my comment would be that at the moment, the way you set this up or you frame this is, I want to explain the massacre, which is fine, right? and which is entirely convincing. However, I wonder if there is a way of turning this around to some extent, i.e. by using the massacre as a window into a broader problem, rather than declaring from the get-go that at the end of it we will walk away from it by knowing why the massacre happened. And it seemed to me that there's a lot of potential in there precisely for how the argument works at the moment. And it is that you are very well positioned here to reconcile, I think, through this particular case, to larger issues in the literature about the transition from empire to nation states, and that's, you know, one side of the literature, as we discussed yesterday, emphasizing the longevity of imperial mindsets and so forth, and the other one emphasizing, you know, the supposed inevitability or inexorability of the rise of nationalist movements. And you actually have a very nice and convincing way of bringing these together, right? So I think there's great potential here to make this a much larger contribution to much wider problems.
Yeah, I mean, those were some of the comments that I would have had too. Basically, you know, kind of, what is the significance? You know, it's a very obvious question, but you know, it's something you've always got to ask, and to think about it in relation to, you know, scholars of empire, scholars of nationalism. You know, how would you make as wide a range of people as possible want to read this paper? Which, as Michael said, you've done so well, and it really is, I think, just a question of framing it in a broader context, so that more people will understand the significance of that very careful archival reconstruction that you've done. You know. Other thoughts and comments? Peter.
Thanks. Thank you for this paper, Joel. I learned a lot from it, and I thought it was a really great example. And going on what Nicola just said, it did strike me that what you've got here is a really beautiful example of what's happening in a lot of the world, and in a lot of, certainly in East Central Europe. You could certainly develop the comparison in order to make your argument even bigger. It is a big argument, and I think it should be. Two smaller questions. First, I just was wondering whether there was any or much distinction in the records you read between an idea of our Christians versus outsider Christians. Just to complicate things a little more, because it's a distinction we often get in violence against refugees in the First World War, and I'm thinking of Jews. And then secondly, so this is a little more complicated. Is the massacre itself at all your subject? I don't think it is, but I think there is a little bit of tension in the way you've written it, because you say there's one point where you sort of evaluate these accounts by sort of saying, well, we can't ever know what really happened. It's probably something in between. And I immediately thought, you're being seduced into saying something you shouldn't say, because it's not your job to explain it. It's your job, I think, here to explain how it's interpreted and used, and that it takes away a bit also from what I really liked, which is you're asking what kind of situation has produced a way of reading violence, rather than simply presuming that, of course, there's going to be violence between these two hostile groups who have always hated each other from time immemorial. I'm thinking of the Balkans. So I don't know how to do it, because I think the reader almost wants you to do it. I certainly wanted you to do it, but I understand you can't explain the massacre, so just be careful. Thanks.
Right, Benny.
It's a relay race. Along the lines of the the comments that have been made about what the focus of the paper is. I agree entirely because you've got such rich material, and it strikes me that what you could do, or the way this should be set up, this is one of these papers that it seems to me it would be well set up with the headline, you know, aha, start with the the massacre, you know, in Aleppo in Aleppo after World War I. There's a little known massacre that took place. Armenians. Not why did this happen, but what did it signify? So rather than start with the forces at play, start with the event, and then you're not going to explain the event, but you're going to explain what does this event really signify. That gets you around this problem of, well, I can't really explain the massacre. What you can do is explain some of the forces that might have been behind it, and that's what you're doing anyway. So the event is to draw your attention to something, and then you're going to explain some of the forces that are behind it. Yeah, and that would be the focus of the paper. Because I like to say, it's such rich material. People are going to want to see that anyway.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments people would like to make? Yes, please.
Yes, I am not qualified to ask a question since I am not a historian. I am a stowaway here, and I have bad hearing, so I could hear only half of what you said. But as a journalist, which is my job, that is someone who doesn't think much, the first question which comes to my mind is this event, this massacre, of which I had not heard, it's not my field, has surely been covered a lot by the press at the time. So how do you compare the different kind of sources, that is, what historians write and their own sources, the archives, what the press, the media has been covering, which is quite often forgotten. People, I feel it seems to me that historians go to archives more than they go and reread the press of the time. And the third category is the writer. Lately, I have read the book by Roland d'Orgelès, who made a journey there, and he reported on another massacre of Armenians in small villages near Damascus. And these are very different point of views, all very interesting. I think if you have not read d'Orgelès, I will give you the reference. It's quite interesting. But how do you compare these three approaches? Since for me as a journalist, I don't know to what extent I have to read and trust what historians say, to what extent I should read the press of the time, and etc.
Thank you. Yes, sorry.
Thank you for the paper. My question probably about the bigger project, because once one reads this paper, it gets very depressive and pessimistic, right? There's no hope, and it seems like the only thing is left now is this league solution of unmixing the population. But a lot of people will insist that there could have been a way to create civic citizenship, either in Syria or in Turkey. So anyway, in the book, or in the version, where does the story goes? I mean, is there any hope to repair? Because if the only solution is either unmixing or living under the rule of another empire, let's say the French Empire, is that solution then seen by other actors as satisfactory? Because the cure looks like the poison. That was my paper topic for the AHR. That it seems like the only medicine is the poison itself. Then it becomes very pessimistic in that regard.
Thank you, Jamil. Anybody else? Michael, you want to come back? Okay, great.
I was intrigued by this thing of the nationalist's dilemma. But
As I should be in a conference about nationalism. You mentioned it at the beginning, then it comes up again, I think, I don't know on what page, let's say 18 or something, by which point I had forgotten what exactly it was. So that's a merely compositional comment. But the more substantial comment is, so rereading the definition is that in order to avoid having an adversarial relationship with minorities, which would seriously undermine their raison d'etre as guides of multi-religious nations, as guides of a multi-religious nation, nationalists resort to a coercive relationship with minorities. So first of all, it's borne out by your case, obviously, but it instantly it causes me to ask a few follow-up questions. One of which would be, so first of all, if they develop a coercive relationship that is an adversarial relationship to some extent, right? So they're not avoiding the adversarial relationship. That's one thing. The next one is that you explain the rationale of the coercive relationship, that they want to be seen as beacons of diversity or something. But apparently that desire doesn't run so high as to avoid developing a coercive and adversarial relationship with these minorities. So I basically couldn't exactly get my head around it. And on top of that, the phrase "the nationalist's dilemma" makes it sound as if it's a general problem of all nationalisms, which it might well be. But I think I'd still require some broader formulation in order to completely memorize what it is and imagine how it can be applied to other cases.
Yes, Emmanuel, of course.
Thanks a lot, Joel. It's a great paper. I knew already a little bit the topic because I've read other things you've written. I just have a quick comment on the interaction between this new, let's say, nationalist conflict between Armenians and Arabs and the old religious hierarchy, and also relates to the reframing a little bit of the paper that was suggested. I agree that if you want to keep it as a chapter in your book, maybe you don't need to restructure it much. It might serve a function in the wider economy of the book that we don't see now because we just see this part. But if you want to publish that as a chapter, maybe the reframing is important, and I agree totally with what was said. My suggestion would be to focus more on the interaction between this old religious principle and the new, let's say, nationalist cleavage, because in some parts it's not entirely clear how the two interact. To me, at least, sometimes it is like all stereotypes and hierarchies influence nationalist, at least conflict, I would say. So for instance, you refer to this. There is this quote about all the rich merchants in Aleppo being Armenian, while in reality most were refugees and very poor. But still, this stereotype that sticks and somehow nourish conflict. But at the same time, you mentioned that let's say, Arab elite wanted to somehow reduce the Armenians to a religious minority that would accept somehow Arab ethnicity, or somehow, in any case, it would be neutralized as a nationalist or ethnic minority and would just be a religious minority that wouldn't put into, wouldn't undermine or question territorial integrity or the sovereignty of the new Syrian state. So it plays around in different ways, and maybe if you refocus the paper around that, you can clarify better the ways in which these two principles interact. Just a thought. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Okay, Joel, we've thrown a lot of comments at you, so now we'll give you a chance to come back.
This is very intimidating, but I'll do my best. Thank you, everyone, for these really great comments. Maybe I can start by saying this is a chapter in my doctoral dissertation, so that explains why, the nationalist dilemma appears and then disappears, because it's in other chapters, and I assume the reader has already read them. So that was my error in composing this paper for the workshop. I totally agree with Professor Goebel and Professor Miller and several others who emphasized it should not just be about why this one thing happened, but what can it teach us about, what is it more broadly applicable? Will it shine light on other problems that are happening in the region? And I hesitate to go that far, but I do have, some ideas about this, which maybe I can just launch out into the atmosphere here, Professor Iden spoke about the cure being worse than the poison, and this is precisely one of the problems that work here, is that Arab nationalism was proposed as the cure for precisely this type of violence, right? The second half of the 19th century saw horrific, unprecedented violence between Muslims and Christians in Syria, and I think the ordinary person was just traumatized and shocked and had no idea why this was happening, because this is not part of their history until now. And one of the big motivations behind Arab nationalism was this idea that religion doesn't matter so much, we can all just be Arabs together, right? And that will be the solution to our problems. And so you get this new ideology of Arab nationalism, but it's layered on top of this older religious hierarchy that never really goes away. And I think incidents like this explain how Christianness was reinscribed into this nominally secular idea of citizenship in the modern nation-state system in the Middle East, right? So on paper, all Egyptians are Egyptians, all Syrians are Syrians, all Iraqis are Iraqis, religion is for God, the fatherland is for all. That was the slogan that almost every nationalist party used in this time period. Nevertheless, they can never really get away from it, because incidents like this and reinscribe, I guess that's the word I'm gonna go with, religious identity into citizenship in a number of strange ways, which becomes a long-lasting problem. And I think the nationalist dilemma that I tried to describe is part of why this happens, because, in a way, Professor Goebel asked, what is the rationale why they apparently desire to have a good relationship with their minorities, but not enough to actually treat them well? And I think part of it is a tension between these two layers, right? You can't go too far in making Christians equal and empowering them to tell their own stories and have their own politics, or you're gonna upset this older hierarchy that you've built your fragile new state on top of, right? So it's much easier to just talk to the bishop and tell him to shut up, or bad things will happen to you, or whatever. But this dilemma is not something I just see in Aleppo. I see it everywhere in the modern Middle East. I see it in Egypt especially, where every dictatorship in Egypt for the last 80 years, I think, has had a very intimate relationship with the Coptic Orthodox Church. And it's a very poisonous relationship in a way that the Pope and the bishops understand that they have to keep the state happy and they have to put on a facade of happiness and national unity, and the burden is on Christians to maintain that facade in a way. And if they ever let it drop, or if they talk about the real problems that they're having, there will be consequences from the state. So that's kind of the dichotomy between an adversarial relationship where the Christians would be openly complaining about how they're treated, and a coercive one where they're under control in a way, but the underlying problems never really go away. Citizenship never becomes fully secular. Professor Judson's questions, it would be wonderful to compare this to similar situations in Eastern Europe. I think there probably is applicability. I need to read more about Eastern Europe to do that, but thank you for that. Is there a sense of our Christians versus outsider Christians? Yes, definitely. I would even say there's a sense of our Armenians versus outsider Armenians. There is a long-standing Armenian community in Aleppo that speaks Arabic, that's very well integrated, and then all these Turkish-speaking Armenians come in from the north and are just kind of displaced. And when you read the Arab commentators who are speaking about this event, they talk about that. They say, we don't have a problem with our Armenians, we have a problem with these guys. Of course, the Armenians themselves, and I would even say the Arab Christians themselves, don't see it that way. They see Christians getting killed in the street, and they know that that can happen to them too, because it happened in 1850, it will happen again in 1936. This is part of the atmosphere in Aleppo at this time, this ever-present threat of riot and massacre. I take on board your point about not making the massacre the subject of the paper. Thank you, Professor Yak, for that excellent advice on how to frame it. I agree. I will work on that. Our monsieur, the journalist in front, it was covered by the press. It was covered by the Arab press, and the Armenian press, very interestingly. And the Armenian press is shut down almost immediately after the massacre, so that they can't talk about it anymore, which I find fascinating. And then the Arab press is state-controlled at the time, and they are very much pushing out a message of, you know, Armenians and Arabs are brothers, this should not happen, good Arabs don't do this, it's kind of the Armenians' fault, but don't do it. And then also in Paris, there's a lot of newspapers and also French Armenian organizations that are distributing pamphlets with first-hand accounts of what happened. So definitely, a good historian has to take the press into account. They have to take autobiographies into account, people who were there, who experienced it as children and wrote about it later. There are several people like that, as well as government archives and diplomatic reports. The challenge is to put these things together in a way where you use them to check each other, right? So the Arabs say, this was a totally spontaneous thing. And then, but every other source is saying, well, it seemed to happen everywhere at the same time, and there were always police involved, and you can check the sources against each other to try to arrive at a closer idea of what really happened. And I would be glad to get that book from you, or that reference from you afterwards. Professor Iden's question, is there any hope? Is there any way at this time to create a real civic citizenship? Is anyone thinking about this? Of course, that is the hope. That is what Professor Soma Makdisi calls, I believe, the ecumenical frame. This is actually the dream of most political actors in the region at this time, to find a way to put aside these ostensible religious differences that are causing so much trouble and unite around a common theme. And I can't explain why that didn't happen. Arab nationalism in this case was not a very good choice. It's really tragicomic because King Faisal, who's in charge of this Arab kingdom, comes to Aleppo 3 months before the massacre, and he gives a speech, and he says, religion doesn't matter. Arabs were Arabs before Jesus, Muhammad, and Moses. He comes back 4 months after the massacre, and he's all angry because they embarrassed him while he was at Paris trying to argue that he should have his own state. And he says, you can't do this, you can't be killing Christians, this is bad. Arabs were Arabs before Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, and Abraham. So it's like he's stuck in this weird path dependence where he can't, he's so committed to this ideology that is clearly causing the problem because it's not even Arabs being persecuted, right? This is not a solution, but he can't escape it somehow. Ottomanism, as Professor Campos talked about yesterday, was a much more plausible way out of this. Unfortunately, due to a variety of contingencies, it exploded into this horrible genocide and war and fragmentation of the empire. So by the time this event happens, everyone is burned out on the idea of Ottomanism. I mean, how could Turks and Arabs and Armenians ever live together? How could, that's just thrown out the window. Obviously, I believe as a human being that some kind of equality and civic citizenship is possible. There's no reason it can't happen in the Middle East, and I fervently hope that it will someday. The Middle East has a much better record than many other countries, including my own, when it comes to coexistence between different groups, and I have a lot of hope, I guess. And thank you, Emmanuel, for your comments. The interaction between the two ideologies kind of, it's not clear how they interact, and I think it's not even clear to the people on the ground. I think people have these ideas in their heads and they have these perceptions and they aren't always even aware of them. They just know that Christians should not be doing this, and we are also the Arab nation, and what are these Armenians doing here in our nation? And they don't necessarily have to sit down over coffee and hammer out all these differences to know that they should do something about this. So I think that ambiguity is very real, and it's part of the problem in this case. I think I answered everyone's question as best as I could. Thank you so much for your kind words and your feedback.
Thank you so much, Joe.